The verdict is in, and former President Jacob Zuma has to face the music. NPA head Shaun Abrahams says he's prosecuting him on corruption charges. Up next, we're joined by Dr. James Grant, a lawyer, and Lawson Naidoo from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, who will be joining us in our Pretoria studio. Let me thank you both, gentlemen, for your time tonight. James, let me perhaps firstly begin with you.
Yes.
There is perhaps a direction that someone to take that seeks to congratulate Shaun Abrahams for making the decision that he has today. But in fact, when we look at history and we look at the Supreme Court of Appeal and how the NPA conducted itself in that particular case, he doesn't deserve any congratulations, does he? No,
I would say that he deserves absolutely no credit whatsoever. He had to take this step. And in fact, if one reviews the record of how, in fact, he has taken the side of Jacob Zuma throughout, and how many decisions of our courts have gone against the NPA and the position that he has endorsed throughout, absolutely no credit deserved.
In fact, when we look at part of what that ruling at the Supreme Court of Appeal said, it said it beggars belief that the present regime of the NPA, on its own version of events, saw it fit to defend Mshe's decision as being rational. And they asked why it took them so long to actually realize at the 11th hour at the time that, in fact, they had no case before the SCA.
Absolutely unforgivable, in fact, and today would have at least restored some faith that they had come to their senses if he began the proceedings by apologizing to the nation.
Lawson, do you agree with that? I mean, is there some form of credibility that Shaun Abrahams leverages tonight?
I think Shaun Abrahams lacks any credibility at all. As you've said, he spent his tenure in office supporting the president's attempts to avoid his day in court, and it's quite astounding that this afternoon Shaun Abrahams says to the country that these issues are ripe for determination by a trial court. This is an obvious matter that he should have realized a long time ago. He should have not have wasted the country's time, the NPA's resources, in siding with Jacob Zuma all the way to the Supreme Court of Appeal. So he deserves absolutely no credit for this decision, and the decision he's taken today is a very self-serving one. He's clearly trying to save his job, with his job very much on the line, with a judgment from the Constitutional Court now imminent.
Lawson, you've consistently argued about his credibility, of course, to hold office. In fact, going as far as saying he shouldn't be the one to make this decision, regardless of what he was going to decide. Do you feel any differently now that he has decided to let the case continue, as it were?
No, I mean, I think, one must first say that we welcome the fact that Jacob Zuma is finally going to have his day in court, something that he proclaimed to want to do a long time ago, but then spent the last many years fighting against that. But, having said that, this is not a decision that Abrahams should have taken. He lacks the credibility to be able to do so. As I said, his job is very much on the line, and as we had argued before the Constitutional Court, it would have been preferable for a NDPP who was in office, whether it was Abrahams or someone else, to take a decision after the Constitutional Court has ruled on the matter.
Do you not have any confidence in him whatsoever, even going forward as being the one who is head of the NPA, at least as it stands, while this case is set to continue?
Well, I think what Abrahams has demonstrated is the fact that he blows with the political winds. The attitude that the NPA have taken since the ANC's national conference in December at Nasrec stands in stark contrast to their attitude before that, in relation to this decision that he took today, for which he had no real alternative, and in other matters. So I think what this shows is that Abrahams is susceptible to political manipulation, whether it's overt or covert, and is therefore unsuitable for office.
On the issue of political manipulation, it certainly is one of those themes, perhaps speaking more broadly, James, that this case is going to bring under the spotlight should it go to trial. And we're talking about different organs of state that would have been affected and that would have had to play a role and being complicit really in the process of ensuring that the president did not have his day in court as he consistently called for. Let's talk about the intelligence services. What's going to come under scrutiny there?
Well, it'll come into question as to how exactly they came about the evidence that he in fact has relied on. And therefore he will be able to put in question any evidence which has been collected. Perhaps short of, one might want to say, the audit report, except that the audit report is also in question by virtue of the fact that one of the leading auditors himself has now been subjected to some suspicion. So there's a lot of evidence that they can throw into question.
But the overall manipulation of state organs, what does this case do in terms of the work that organizations like yourself, Lawson, as CASAC are doing in order to ensure that they are really free from any kind of interference?
Well, you know, regrettably, the NPA has been one of those organs that has been subject to political influence and interference over a long period of time. You know, if we go back to the very start of this saga in 2004, when Bulelani Nguka said he was not going to prosecute Zuma, even though there was a prima facie case. And, you know, the reality is that Zuma should have been prosecuted alongside Shabir Shaikh at that time. So, you know, this is an ongoing saga, and one has to welcome the statement, the clear statement that was made by President Cyril Ramaphosa in the State of the Nation address last month, where he listed as one of the priorities in dealing with the credibility gap and the leadership issues within the NPA. That's something I think that needs to be done as a matter of urgency to restore credibility in that institution, to restore credibility in the criminal justice system and in the very rule of law itself.
James, the argument has been made that over the years, the reason why the former president engaged in the courts the way we saw him do was to delay the cases. Does he still have any more room for that before we get to the actual merits of what he will be arguing?
I think he has very little room for further delay tactics. I can imagine that he might squabble about whether full disclosure has been made in terms of the evidence that was ordinarily made available to an accused person, but he might be able to push it out for a couple of months further. The real delay is going to come in the coordination of the diaries by the various members of the prosecution team and the defense team in order to find the chunks of time that will be required to hear this, I think.
All right. And in terms of the actual case itself, what kind of arguments are we expecting the president to make when he does finally have his day in court?
Now that's where it could get really interesting, because we heard today for the first time from Shaun Abrahams some sort of mention that that Zuma has raised the defense of that he didn't have intention. Now what does that really mean? It means that we might expect a second round of being subjected to what exactly dolus eventualis really means.
Please don't take us back there.
Because what's going to be put in issue, and if I may just indicate that pretty much all three of the main crimes that have been charged here, so fraud, corruption, racketeering, all require intention, and if they cannot be proved, then he cannot be convicted. So what's going to be put in issue here is, did he know? Did he know that these things amounted to some sort of benefit as a question of fact? And even if that's managed, if the state manages to prove that, then he can always fall back on another defense, which is, did he know that doing this was prohibited in law? What am I suggesting? Could he raise the defense of mistake of law? Well, many people will say it's not a defense. Sorry, it is a defense in South Africa. So he has that avenue. What does a person do when it looks like all the evidence in the world is against them and they must have done it? What did OJ do? He said, I was set up. This is a possibility.
Although, as we're speaking, we're also seeing some breaking news online. This is from Times Live. Schabir Shaik confirming that he will testify in this case. So the fact that he's already been convicted and in fact served jail time, does that not strengthen the state's case at all?
It helps to show that there was what we would call the wrongful conduct requirement, but that doesn't in any way establish that Jacob Zuma must have known, which is what the state is going to have to prove, that he must have known that what was being required of him was to exert, for instance, some sort of improper influence, that he must have known that what these things amounted to, that he was receiving, amounts to some sort of benefit. These are all questions of fact. He might just claim that he was just absolutely stupid or naive about all of this. And then he might fall back on saying, well, no matter that Mr. Shaik understood that this was all wrong, I didn't.
And it certainly wouldn't be a new argument that we've heard in the cases that we've seen. Lawson, if we just go to the ESCOM inquiry that has been taking place in Parliament and the various statements that have been made by ministers who faced allegations of corruption, people saying, well, I wasn't party to any of this, I simply couldn't have known. How much responsibility does it then put on organizations like yourself when it comes to substantiating, you know, allegations and ensuring that whatever people are accused of, that actually can stand, you know, can stand the test within a court of law?
Well, I think, you know, if we're talking in relation to the issues around state capture, then there's a huge amount of evidence that has been brought into the public domain by a range of civil society organizations that's been exposed through the Gupta leaks emails, through the revelations from investigative journalists, as well as through the parliamentary inquiry. So there's, you know, a lot of evidence, prima facie evidence that exists of state capture and corruption. When we come back to the Jacob Zuma trial, you know, the evidence of someone like Schabir Shaik is going to be very telling. Now, you know, it's difficult to preempt exactly what evidence Mr. Shaik is going to offer to the court, but if it speaks to the issue of the quid pro quo in that relationship, because let's not forget that, you know, corruption involves a transaction between two willing partners, and, you know, Mr. Shaik has been convicted on the one hand, but the recipient of the corrupt funds has not been tried as yet. So that's going to be the critical factor there, as James says, to establish the knowing complicity of Jacob Zuma in that whole saga.
Of course, this moment also speaks a lot about where we are in our democracy and the power of the country's constitution. If I can get both your insights, maybe let me begin with you, James, into that.
I think this all points to a very sad fact of just how, in a sense, weak we are, that one man right at the top could have virtually caused our constitutional, sold our constitutional democracy and brought it to its knees as he had. And yes, we seem to be on the right track by virtue of having a different person at the helm right now. But God knows, God help us when somebody else takes the helm.
Lawson?
Well, I think, you know, a slightly different view on that, because I think it's not just one man. It was Zuma was able to do this with the complicity and the connivance of the National Prosecuting Authority. You know, initially Mokotedi Mshe took the decision to drop the charges against Zuma. It has been supported by successive national directors and acting national directors, and that's been the real problem, is the state capture of a critical institution such as the NPA, and we need a clean-up at the NPA, as I said earlier, in order to restore respect for that institution and in order to enable us to move forward. So this is a small step forward in announcing these charges, but the state capture revelations have indicated that there are charges that need to be brought against many, many other high-profile public officials, and we await those decisions being taken as well.
And it also points to, I think, a responsibility about the kind of discourse that we have within the public sphere and the kind of pressure that can come out of whether it is political parties, whether it is NGOs or civil society organizations. Doesn't it, Grant, to the extent that there has been a time where it was not favorable for people to fight for this case to continue, and now it seems a more favorable time, but that's all according to the political wind, isn't it?
Just like it's very difficult to find a white person who voted for the National Party, you struggle to find anybody now who supported Jacob Zuma. I mean, it's atrocious how people's spines seem to bend so easily. And just to support something that Lawson said a moment ago, let us not forget that we're only talking today about the possible charges against Jacob Zuma for what he did before he became president. These charges do not relate to charges that might arise from him having sold our constitutional democracy. There are many hundred charges that might arise from that. And I mention that because it's a further indictment on Shaun Abrahams that he didn't begin today by saying, sorry people, this doesn't have to do with the further possible 10 or 20 or 100 charges that might be brought against this man, but I'm only dealing with what he did in the early 2000s.
All right, final thoughts from you, Lawson?
Well, I think, you know, as you asked just now, Cathy, it's really an issue that the Constitution and the rule of law has triumphed at the end of the day. It's taken a very long time, but it shows that the rule of law still functions in South Africa, and, you know, people can run, but they won't hide forever.
All right. Well, it's certainly going to be an interesting case going forward. And when it comes to those legal arguments, James, I'm not looking forward to another round of dolus eventualis.
The
Oscar trial took us through a lot of that. And so I imagine we'll all be learning a little bit more about the law than we had before. Dr. James Grant and Lawson Naidoo giving us their reaction to this breaking story that we're focusing on Newsnight.